I've been starting, stopping, scrapping, and starting this video all over again all year. Literally since the top of the year when I became aware of DC Mayor Muriel Bowser's crime bill. By this video, I mean the 7 deadly sins of black politicians. But like I said, I've started and scrapped quite a few different versions of this video this year because how I feel keeps changing. Initially, I was frustrated with the emergence of more and more black mayors, fighting against progressive movements, championing anti-black policies, or outright turning their cities into police states. And I thought the 7 deadly sins framework would allow me to tackle many different politicians and what's happening on the ground for their black constituents. And I thought that would be easy and fun, so fair enough. But then I started thinking about it either too much or just enough. I'm not sure, the jury's still out. And then I thought, well, if I'm going to highlight specific actions taken by these politicians and classify them as the 7 deadly sins of black politicians, wouldn't their actions need to be perceived as sinful by the black majority or the majority of their constituents? I thought it's probably flawed somehow to declare particular conduct by black politicians as deadly sins against the black community if black people don't generally disapprove of the conduct, which ended up becoming a problem for me in my little 7 deadly sins framework, because the very core of my gripe with many of the black politicians who will find themselves in this video is their commitment to over-policing black people, to over-incarcerating black people, to demonstrating to the white power structure that they have the ability to control black people, to keep their black populations in line. But the frustrating truth that I've been sitting with, chewing over and mulling over, especially when I really sat with James Forman Jr.'s book, Locking Up Our Own, is that many black people, certainly far more than those who identify as abolitionists, believe in the criminal justice system, in prisons, in legal retribution, in punishment, in policing, in law and order. Many black people believe we just need to be represented more in systems of power and that things will change. But that some of us, maybe even many of us, need to be locked up.
But I want to be clear, I know some of us love our children, but some of our children are so far gone that we're going to have to put some of them to sleep in order to take back the neighborhood. Some of y'all don't want to hear that because you don't live in reality. But I'm telling you, as a psychologist, I'm not going to be able to psychologize all of them on the corner. Some of them going to sleep for good!
And that is just way, 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 way deeper and significantly more nuanced and requires a lot of depth, context, and history to truly discuss and unpack than I was prepared to give. So the video got scrapped. And I started again. But then on the heels of publishing my last Eric Adams Olurinatti production, I didn't want to be perceived as only attacking black politicians. Because while every black politician I critique is with good reason, and honestly not done lightly, I don't make a habit of going after politicians regularly in general, much less arbitrarily. It's still not lost upon me the eagerness with which people rush to eat up critiques of black politicians, especially black Democrats or progressives, but they drag their feet to engage with critiques of significantly more harmful white politicians, especially if they're Republican. Because look, I have a scathing documentary on Eric Adams, and I have one on Greg Abbott too, but there's a difference in which people flock to. I have tons of videos critiquing many different white or Republican politicians, and they fly under the radar and away from people's interests. So as far as the majority of people who don't regularly interact with my content, it could appear that I only go after black Democrats, and that would be enough for a lot of black people who I mentioned earlier are not as radical or anti-policing as I am to dismiss me as someone who just wants to attack black people, who doesn't understand the intricacies of what black people in power are up against, who is unrealistic, etc., etc. And I am wary of that. So the video got scrapped again. But you know, when I have a song on my heart, I just have to sing it. In this case, post-election, I actually don't really have that song on my heart, but I already wrote the lyrics, okay? So even if it takes me a few times to figure out what key I should sing it in, y'all finna hear this tune. And what's the key, you ask? It's the one where I state up front that there are a lot of black politicians, yes, even elected officials, who are doing some good things to help black and working class people, to combat injustice in the criminal system. And in every bit of the small ways individuals can help, they are helping. I'm thinking about Governor Wes Moore, who pardoned 175,000 people who had marijuana-related convictions. And on a local level here in New York, I'm thinking of folk like Councilmember Chiose, who does cool shit like this.
We just voted to kill forced broker fees in New York City. I'm leaving City Hall right now where we just passed my bill, the FAIR Act, which requires that whoever hires a broker pays the fee. So tenants are done paying fees to brokers they never wanted nor hired.
Or Congressman Jamal Bowman, who not only served his black and brown constituents in the Bronx well, but spoke up to rebuke the genocide in Gaza and battled AIPAC as hard as he could after they successfully spent historic amounts of money to unseat him. At the same time, there are others who have done some good things for black people in criminal justice, while simultaneously doing some maybe even worse things to criminal justice and black people that are in keeping with some of the people who will make this list. I haven't quite figured out how to critique this class of leaders I'm thinking of, because one, there's evidence that maybe their hearts are in the right place, that they see themselves as progressives who are on our side and trying. And two, I don't think I personally know the political landscape they exist within and the history of their communities enough to feel comfortable making any strong condemnations about their character or to question their love and commitment to Black people or the communities that they serve. They're in limbo, political purgatory if you wish. I'm thinking about the mayor of Birmingham, Alabama, Randall L. Woodfin, who is fine, respectfully. But the Birmingham mayor is an example of who I mean because he has done some good things, like pardoned 15,000 marijuana convictions and created the Pardon for Progress initiative to allow anyone with a misdemeanor conviction for marijuana in Birmingham to apply for a pardon to remove the barriers that come along with a criminal conviction. But on the flip side, he does things like form a crime commission and drop a statement saying shit like this, quote, "But we're not yet done. This investigation continues with the Birmingham Police Department and we will not rest until our streets are safer. Violent criminals operating with Birmingham will be pursued relentlessly and brought to justice without delay. Our commitment to swift arrests and seamless coordination with local, state, and federal partners that has been strengthened over the past 2 years will help ensure that these criminals are prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law, ensuring that crime will not continue to thrive in our city. Violent criminals know that Birmingham Police Department and our fellow law enforcement partners will be aggressively pursuing you. We are aggressively getting more police on the streets, working on legislation to get automatic weapons off the street, and engaging our community in finding innovative ways to deal with violent crime. The people in Birmingham are pulling together to win this fight, and we will," end quote. So, that obviously doesn't sound like someone poised to rectify the long history of over-policing, over-incarceration, and systemic racial injustice in Birmingham. But at the same time, I live in New York City, and that's Birmingham, Alabama, and I am not arrogant enough to assume I understand what kind of political landscape he's working in, what he could say and remain in power, what he could reasonably get done, or what even older Black people and voters who definitely do worry about crime and see the traditional system as the only way to address it would think about him if he said some anti-policing type shit. I just don't know. So purgatory for him. I'm also thinking of the mayor of Baltimore, Brandon Scott, whose stated core values are more aligned with the progressive approach to policing and criminal justice. How he described it on his website, quote, "He emerged as a leading voice in reducing violence in Baltimore and reinstated council oversight of the Baltimore Police Department by holding quarterly hearings. He believes that reducing violence will require a holistic, all-hands-on-deck approach, one that recognizes violence as fundamentally a public health issue. He led legislative initiatives that created extensive crime data sharing and online reporting of crimes by Baltimore Police Department. In 2016, Scott introduced and passed legislation creating an open data policy in Baltimore," end quote. But then, on the flip side of that, he's supporting the building of a $330 million joint training facility for Baltimore's police and fire departments on West Baltimore's Copen State University campus. In other words, he is supporting the building of a cop city in Baltimore. And if you don't know what cop city is, we'll talk about that later in the video when we talk about Andre Dickens. Oh yeah, he is not safe. But anyway, yeah, for the mayor of Baltimore, purgatory. Because again, Baltimore has a deep history and complicated political and social landscape. So I just don't know what that man is navigating or how the people in Baltimore who do what I do in New York City feel about him. So I just can't condemn him as a sinner just yet. And that's also where I stand on Chicago's Mayor Brandon Johnson, a progressive that I think has disappointed his supporters in some ways, not disappointed them in others, and still has some time to do a lot. So I want to hold my horses for now because I'm trying to operate with a maturity that considers, one, that some people maybe want to do the right things, but they can't do everything they want to, and they're trying to do what they can. And two, that my views are not representative of the majority of Black people or the majority of voting Black people. And for these politicians, it's probably not strategically savvy or an electable position to do or say what I want them to anyway. So, purgatory, because again, I am reckoning with number 2 and trying to operate with a spirit of grace. But grace is not blindness. And I can see that some of these motherfuckers need to go to hell. Because while some are trying, some are moving like the enemy. Because lesson number 1, Black people can be anti-Black and or do things that are rooted in anti-Blackness or specifically, and in some cases even intentionally, harm the Black community. Sometimes, Black people working within systemically racist institutions perpetuate even deeper anti-Blackness towards Black people than their non-Black colleagues as a means of overcompensating for their Blackness.
Black police showing out for the white cop.
And I am tired of these kinds of Black characters, both Democrat and Republican. But I will in this video and generally discuss more the issues with problematic Black Democrats than I do Black Republicans. Because while I theoretically like to expect more from Black Democrats, I absolutely do not expect anything but disappointment, coonery, and deep shamefulness, shamelessness, and behavior only worthy of Uncle Ruckus from Black Republicans. So do not mistake any criticisms of the Black Democrats in this video to mean the Black Republicans and Republicans in general are anything less than coons and white supremacists. The reason you hear me bothering to discuss and critique these Black Democrats is because they're the only ones worth engaging. We can do something about them. They can be muscled. And more importantly, the base they serve and the council members around them can be muscled. And they often are. I am not spending my energies talking about Black Republicans much because there's no point. They're a lost cause. Like, look at this. Look at this.
For as obsessed as the media are with race, they sure are working hard not to say my name. First female elected as lieutenant governor in the Commonwealth's history. Keep your hands off of our Second Amendment rights.
Do you think that you are going to get through to a person like that? Yeah, no. And there's also not that many Black Republicans in office, and they often wield very little power. They are mostly inconsequential. Their only purpose on earth is to serve as something white Republicans can use as a shield when they're accused of racism. Like, no, it's not racist, the said it. Anyhow, not the point. Anyhow, I'm getting off topic. I've been thinking a lot about problematic Black politicians. Because if you know me, I usually spend my time battling New York City's top cop mayor and Mixie con man Eric Adams, who's probably gonna be pardoned by Donald Trump, but whatever. But earlier this year, I had turned my attention to Philadelphia's Mayor Sherrell Parker and DC's Mayor Muriel Bowser, who are all following in his footsteps. In so many ways, Lori Lightfoot walked so they could all run. But I am not gonna kick Lori's back in right now, not because I'm compassionate. I just rather we focus on politicians who are currently in office, wreaking havoc on the Black communities that elected them. Because we need to be aware, especially in the case of these anti-Black, tough on crime Black Democrats, because they are the most dangerous. Because many people just assume they're progressive without further investigation. Which, side tangent, is really the problem progressives run into with Democrats in general. Time and time again, we tell folk that politicians aren't who do the work and get things we want done. We are. But when a Democrat is elected, people assume their job is done and they check out until next election season, when that's when we really have to start doing the work. But Black people often just assume Black tough on crime Democrats are progressives, working in Black people's interests, and white liberals vote for them precisely because they're not. But by being Black, they get to pay lip service to diversity and insulate themselves from critiques of racism and anti-Blackness and being pro-police or trying to maintain the status quo. It's a conundrum that is whooping our ass. I've been talking to Cop City activists and thinking about Atlanta specifically, in the sense of questioning how we end up with one of the Blackest cities in the country, with pretty much all Black leadership and governance, selling itself as a Black Mecca. Meanwhile, reality is that though there is a wealthy elite of Black people in Atlanta, the wealth disparity between them and the average Black Atlantan is severe, with more than 21.6% of Atlantans living in poverty and 31% of Atlanta's children living in poverty. And what's that all Black leadership doing? Bending over backwards to police the out of the Black people. Oh my God. In fact, consider that the underlying theme of this video. Black people who don't just want to police the shit out of Black people. Oh no, no, no. They want a literal police state. They want to give the police endless control to lock these up. But why do they want to do it, and why are we electing them? We could talk forever about this. But to get to the answers to those questions, the first thing I think we need to do is ask another question. And that's, who are these Black politicians working against our collective interests? Or in better words, what do they all have in common? These are going to be the people who, one, have capitalized on their Blackness, or more specifically, the Black community's susceptibility to supporting Black candidates who present themselves as avatars for Black excellence, Black success, Black wealth, and Black respectability, without critically interrogating how commitment to those myths animate their politics and the world they'll shape for other Black people who do not and cannot model those things. And two, people who have offered their Blackness as a shield for white people who don't want to be called racist. So they elect Black people who promise to more heavily police Black people because they believe they can't be called racist beyond a shadow of a doubt if they voted for a Black person. It's the reason why in the scene in Get Out, when the father meets Daniel Kaluuya's character, he makes a point to tell him he voted for Obama. This is the curse of representation just for representation's sake. It's the fundamental problem with believing that diversifying racist institutions will fundamentally change the institution, when in reality, the diverse members are required to more harshly punish their own in order to prove their worth and purpose to the institution that they serve. When you consider those two elements, it becomes a little easier to identify which skinfolk ain't kinfolk. Not foolproof though. That's why we have political purgatory, while we figure it out. But for the rest of them, let's line these sinners up, okay? It is time for the 7 deadly sins of Black politicians. Let's go. I want to start off slow, let you get your feet wet. So why not start with the sin of being a sloth? Because what do you associate sloths with in your mind? Slow! And I hate to slander poor sloths to animals like this, but they're not the brightest bulbs in the lamp. But seriously, the sin of being a sloth is to be lazy, to be slow, to fail to utilize your talents, to be a good-for-nothing ass. And when I think of a slow, good-for-nothing son of a bitch who failed to live up to their potential, well, a few people come to mind. I was supposed to say Clarence Thomas, but as I was writing slow and failed to live up to their potential, Ben Carson's face popped up too. Y'all remember Ben Carson? I know, that's a blast from the past, but Ben Carson, not to be confused with Herman Cain, a mistake I often make. Did you know that before Ben Carson came out as a Trump-supporting coon of a politician, he was a respected Black neurosurgeon with a Black wife, unlike many of his fellow Black Republicans that may appear in this video, who inspired a generation of Black doctors and Black boys? All that Black excellence Black people love to see, and then, well,
when you look at what the Black community has been through, go all the way back to slavery. It was the family, the strong family units, and the faith in God that got people through that. They got people through Jim Crow, through severe segregation, through all the difficulties. But what really had a negative impact was when the government came along and said, there, you poor little thing. I'm going to take care of all your needs, and started implementing policies that were destructive to family formation. Those are the things that have hurt the Black community the most.
But listen, Ben, he not even in office no more. The person truly guilty of this sin is the Black man who replaced the Thurgood Marshall, who started taking gifts and money from Republican billionaire Harlan Crow almost immediately after getting on the bench, then spent 10 whole ass years in the Supreme Court never speaking. Like, he dead ass did not ask a single question in oral arguments for a decade. And when he did start talking, it was to do things like gleefully overturn the right to abortion and tell us he believes the court has a duty to overturn a bunch of other rights it gave us, except the right to interracial marriage. Let's give it up for Clarence Thomas, y'all. A Black man who the only time he ever acknowledged he was Black or even interested in another Black person was when he was defending himself for sexually harassing Anita Hill.
As a Black American, as far as I'm concerned, it is a high-tech lynching for uppity Blacks.
And if you look in the background of that clip, you can see his wife, Ginny Thomas, a MAGA supporter who has several cases related to her involvement in the January 6th insurrection. Dog, that's who he's married to and has children with. This was the only Black representation on the Supreme Court of the United States for more than 20 years. Ginny Thomas, wife of Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, has been called out again for her advocacy work, this time opposing reforms like term limits and ethical codes for the court. While left-leaning outlets like ProPublica are all over this, reporting on her ties to right-wing think tanks and her influence over cases her husband rules on, you'll notice something interesting on Ground News, that barely any right-leaning outlets are covering this story at all. This is why stepping outside of echo chambers is so important. Only following sources that align with your views means missing stories like this or only seeing one side. And that's where Ground News comes in, the app and website that I've partnered with today. By gathering every article they can find reporting on a story, Ground News makes it easy to spot which angles are emphasized, downplayed, or ignored, depending on where you get your news. Because not seeing the full picture can have real-world implications, from shaping public opinion to public policy, I personally love using their blind spot feed to find more important stories missing from different media bubbles, like Maryland and Delaware sending Black women to the Senate in a historic first. Ground News really cannot be beat. They make it so easy for me to make sure that I am not spewing unsubstantiated mess or being biased and trifling. Plus, in this particular climate where everyone's targeting you with clickbait and misinformation, and it's hard to tell what's real, what's fake news, and what's just straight up propaganda, and maybe even AI, a tool like Ground News is invaluable. Right now, Ground News is offering my viewers 50% off their unlimited access Vantage plan, their best deal of the year. But this offer is only available for a limited time, so you better jump on it. Go to ground.news/Olay or scan the QR code on screen to get started today. By subscribing, you're not just getting an amazing resource, you're supporting independent journalism and helping make the media more honest and transparent. Thank you, Ground News, for sponsoring the video. And while I'm talking about this sloth just listen to this dodo bird, Herschel Walker.
People want to ask me all the time why I'm running. I'm sick and tired. I'm sick and tired of them wanting to teach CTR in school.
I'll tell you something else I heard. Now think about this, because at one time science said man came from apes. Did it not? That's when you go to the science.
Every time I read or hear that, I think to myself, you just didn't read the same Bible I did.
Well, this was interesting, though. If that is true, why are there still apes? Think about it.
You know, now you're getting too smart for it.
No. Think about this. We have an evolution that is, we've gotten so intelligent that if that is true, why are there still apes? And then the conception of a baby. Let me tell you, science can't do that. They still trying to do it.
We, in America, have some of the cleanest air and cleanest water of anybody in the world. That's right. So what we do is we're going to put from the Green New Deal millions or billions of dollars cleaning our good air up. So all of a sudden China and India ain't putting nothing in there cleaning that situation up. So all that bad air is still there. But since we don't control the air, our good air decided to float over to China, bad air. So when China gets our good air, that bad air gotta move.
And Herschel Walker has also committed the sin of lust, seeing as he had all kind of love children popping up in the middle of his campaign. Ciao.
Stories for you tonight. One day after admitting to having fathered a second son, Georgia U.S. Senate candidate Herschel Walker now says that he's the father of another son as well as a daughter. Until earlier this week, Walker had only publicly mentioned his 22-year-old son, Christian Walker. Well, this morning news broke of a third son out of wedlock who is now 13 years old, and now an adult daughter who was born when he was the running back star for the University of Georgia.
Oh, God. Oh, God. Now, the sin of lust. Lust is the strong desire for something, but it doesn't have to be. On its face, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but when it's a politician with a lust for more and more power, it can be truly dangerous. This is a sin so many politicians are guilty of. So many on this list are guilty of, but a few really stand out to me. A lot of Black Republicans are simply mouthpieces for white supremacy, who accomplish very little and wield little power or leave office without ever entering the public zeitgeist or our consciousness. While others take cooning to a level that is not just about having an inferiority complex and wanting to be validated by the whites, but about deeply hating Black people. And that, former Kentucky Attorney General Daniel Cameron, the bastard that refused to charge the officers who brutally murdered 26-year-old Breonna Taylor, who'd been sleeping in her bed before idiot, murderous, plainclothes police officers broke into her home and shot her to death, then arrested her fiance for trying to protect him and his fiance. But it's not just that he didn't charge the officers for murdering Breonna Taylor, it's also that he did charge one of the officers, not for murdering Breonna, but for wanton endangerment by shooting into the neighbor's apartment. And that man, Daniel Cameron, did all that clamoring for power to gear himself up for a run for governor, only to still lose. Loser bitch. Second up is DC's Mayor Muriel Bowser, whose lust for power and control had her introducing one of the most draconian-ass expansions of police power I've personally ever seen. This woman is responsible for what I call the DC crime bill. Yeah, 30 years after the 1994 crime bill caused the mass incarceration of countless Black people, this Black woman introduced a law that would give police so much unchecked power. In the most expansive reading of the DC crime bill, it gave the police the power to 1, designate any neighborhood they want a high-risk area, and once done, they can stop, search, or arrest anyone walking with so much as a single other person. 2, arrest anyone wearing any kind of face covering at the sole discretion of the police. 3, demand anyone riding the metro provide the police with their name and address or face arrest. 4, legally kill suspects during car chases. 5, to allow police to review their body camera footage before writing their statements.
That's suspicious.
6, it made it a crime to discard a gun. It made it so it becomes a separate crime the moment the gun touches the ground. I say separate crime because, follow along, Illegal gun possession is already a crime. So if someone possessed the gun illegally, they could and would already be being prosecuted for that. What this provision did was add a criminal charge if you decide to discard or drop a gun when being confronted by the police. This is one of the worst provisions in the law because it doesn't take too much imagining to realize how deadly the consequences would be in a country where police have repeatedly killed Black people under the stated justification that they so much as thought they were armed, whether legally or not. So imagine what happens when this law disincentivizes people to put their gun down because this makes it another crime, which is a problem in a nation where keeping the gun on you is all the police need to justify giving you a death sentence. They need only say they fired because you were armed. And I want to remind you, these are just but a handful of provisions from this horrific law. The law is much, much worse and expansive than this. Among other things, the DC crime bill also cut funding for SNAP food stamps. It cut funding for homeless prevention and eviction support. It cut funding for emergency rental assistance. It cut funding for transitional support from shelter programs, youth reentry diversion programs, and domestic violence support. And do you want to hear some of the shit she had in the law before advocates successfully pushed back on it? If she had her way, the law would have also prohibited the public from knowing if an officer who was found guilty of misconduct is still on active duty or not. Dog, why do you think that is? Think about it. If she had it her way, the law would have not only let cops review their body camera footage before they write their statements, but also it would have had their status concealed from the public if they had committed police misconduct before. That's not suspicious? Dog, I'm on to her. But back to lusting for power. Because Eric Adams has been lusting for power since he was a kid. If you watch my Eric Adams, the Worst Mayor in America video, you already know this. But Eric Adams became a cop precisely because he wanted power. He was in a gang hitting licks, and after the police arrested him and beat the dog shit out of him when he was 14 years old, instead of hating the cops, this decided that the police were who really run things. He said, these have the juice, I'm gonna go do that. So he left one gang to join the biggest gang in America, the NYPD. Mind you, did you know the NYPD has more than 35,000 police officers? Yeah, but it's one city. We have got more police officers in this city than some countries have in their militaries. Anyway, that lust for power is what made Eric Adams become a police. And it's precisely what made him put NYPD on his back. Eric Adams is seeing to it that he and the NYPD are unstoppable. And you know how you become unstoppable? By keeping the public in the dark about what you're doing, so they don't feel compelled to rise up against you. Which is precisely why when the block got hot for Eric Adams about the mounting deaths of people awaiting trial at Rikers, he decided to have the Department of Corrections stop letting the public know about the deaths altogether. You can't receive public outrage if the public doesn't know what they should be outraged about. And that's not the extent of how far he'd take it. He hired thousands more NYPD officers, he gave them the biggest deal they've ever seen, and wait for it, this brought back stop and frisk. Despite running on ads targeted towards the Black community about how he experienced police brutality as a teen and became a cop to fight against it, Adams could not wait to bring stop and frisk back, which was found unconstitutional in 2011 because of NYPD's racist use against Black and Hispanic people. But it's worse now under our Black-ass Mayor Eric Adams than even during the Bloomberg era. NYPD has stopped tens of thousands of people since Adams took over, and 97% of the people stopped have been Black or Hispanic. And worse than that, Adams has not only overseen NYPD's use of stop and frisk, he specifically revived and rebranded an NYPD unit that had been disbanded for their disproportionate number of police shootings of Black people in 2020. And it's those units that he rebranded in order to carry out stop and frisk. Ain't that some shit? And where there's a lust for power, there's usually an envious motherfucker hoping to take a page out of that book. Let's talk envy. In New York City, Eric Adams already brought back stop and frisk. But next door in Philadelphia, their first woman mayor, Sherelle Parker, is hoping to do the same. Shorty loves the police, and she let that be known right out of the gate the night she was elected. She told the city of Philadelphia up front she was going to be hiring hundreds of cops, implementing stop and frisk, and getting to work on locking everybody's asses up. Shorty wants to use the police to stop and search people in such a way that even the Republican she was running against said it wasn't possible to have officers do what she wanted without violating people's rights. And please know, as soon as she got into office, she got right to banning and criminalizing ski masks and expanding the police force. Which is why it should come as no shock that Philadelphia police murdered 28-year-old Alexander Spencer while stopping and frisking him. But let's leave Philly and bounce back to my beloved New York City so we can discuss greed. Should not shock you that Eric Adams makes this list again. What can I say? I can't help it. His greediness is precisely exactly why he's been federally indicted for illegal kickbacks, straw donor schemes, illegally misappropriating $10 million in public funds for his own campaign, taking bread, trips, and doing favors for Turkish government officials. It's why his entire administration is resigned, because they were all out here doing dirt, trying to make sure, quote, everybody eats, as one of them put it. Watch my second Eric Adams video, The End of Eric Adams, to get deep in the weeds. But if you watch my first Eric Adams video, you already knew this greedy thief had been lying to the IRS from time. There is a popular widespread belief that Eric Adams lives in New Jersey, even though he now insists he lives in Brooklyn, because he needs to live in New York City in order to be New York City mayor. Go figure. Why does that matter in terms of his greed? Well, it's that lying that got his greedy ass caught up at the IRS. See? Eric Adams had bought a Bed-Stuy apartment building from the federal government when he was an NYPD captain for just $361,000. And that didn't pay taxes in 2017, 2018, or 2019 on any rental income he collected from his tenants. And he reported to the IRS that he spent just enough on repairs to the building to write off the entire amount he collects in rent. And he also reported that he did not live in the Brooklyn apartment building he now claims he resides in, because property owners are allowed to write off their expenses on rental units, not residential units they live in. So it's either he doesn't live in Brooklyn for real, at which point he's lying now, or he does live in Brooklyn, at which point he was lying then. Either way, he was lying to the IRS to avoid paying what he owed. Eric Adams dodging paying his taxes. Meanwhile, New Yorkers spent $114.5 million of our taxpaying dollars to cover NYPD's police misconduct settlements, which is nearly double what we paid in 2020 before Eric Adams became mayor. But we not done with greedy New York just yet. Richie Torres? Bring that ass here, boy. If you don't know Richie Torres, he's a Bronx congressman. Now, Richie is many things. He's a congressman, he's black, he's Latino, he's queer, but above all else, he's in deep in AIPAC's pocket, okay? That mother goes up for Israel, okay? You don't know not nary a Zionist or Jewish man fighting for Israel like Richie Torres fights for Israel. And that's because AIPAC is that top campaign contributor, and it's not close either. And that's greed. And that greed, his need for AIPAC money, has him out here like ceasefire, thrall, and protesting college students the out from the river to the sea. I'll lock you terrorist bitches up. That mother does not play about Israel, I tell you. And he will tweet you into oblivion about it and block your ass with the mother quickness. Child. Anyway, I don't know about y'all, but when I think about greed, I also think about gluttony. When I think of greed, I think about gluttony, but on crack. I think that's the only way to describe the level of black people selling out black people going on in Atlanta. Because the greater problem is that while Atlanta masquerades as a kind of black mecca, the reality just does not quite add up. And it hasn't added up for a while.
In Atlanta, it's referred to as the Atlanta way. A lot of cool scholars have sort of like fleshed out this concept, you know, throughout the last century of how the Atlanta way works. And it really is sort of like this strategic partnership between black political leadership and then white economic leadership, where they really work hand in hand, of course, you know, just for the upper class elites and at the cost of, you know, especially Atlanta's black residents. Atlanta in the last, you know, couple decades has gone from a majority black city to now black folks comprise less than 50% of the city's population. Because of all of these policies, you know, it's such a sort of ground zero for major development, really rapid development. The Olympics in the 90s, they tore down a bunch of public housing. They passed a bunch of new anti-homelessness laws, like really sort of explicitly racist things were happening. Activists found that basically before like big events in the Olympics, police were going around with these pre-printed tickets that had on them African-American male homeless and just rounding them up and throwing them in the jail.
Is that what y'all end up with? I recently heard about like the Red Dogs.
Yeah, this sort of like notorious police unit that was like disbanded after, you know, a bunch of, you know, horrible high profile incidents, but then have like sort of been, you know, as a lot of these units do, they often get, you know, sort of new life with different names, you know?
Yeah. And that brings us to today.
There's a gentleman named Bill Torpy who who is an opinion columnist at the AJC, and I can't remember which of his pieces this was, but he often falls back on the line that like, hey, this is a Black mayor and multiple Black city council members who came to this decision. Therefore, like you can't say anything about it, and he is white. And that's, yeah, there's a lot of falling behind sort of the myth of the Black Mecca here. And I feel like that's starting to unravel, finally.
Yeah. Remember I mentioned the cop city they're trying to build in Baltimore? Well, where does all this Cop City madness begin? Well, people already familiar with the Stop Cop City movement might assume the answer is Atlanta, but it's not.
Atlanta's wasn't even the first. The first, in 2017, Chicago started working to build Cop Academy, which has this sort of similar compound nature to it, this mock village in order to train. And so Cop City followed Chicago's Cop Academy. And now, there's proposals sprouting up all over the place, all over the country, rural, urban, huge one proposed in Baltimore. They're really all over the place. The plans, are not just to train, a city's police force, it's also to train with each other, and that's domestic and international. I mean, the connections are everywhere. In Israel, there's a training facility that they refer to as Mini Gaza that has existed for years. It's just like, it's all over the
exactly place. Because they're learning the tactics that they want to use on those particular people, and that's that's the most obvious part about where it's popping up. Atlanta, Chicago, Baltimore, where you're hearing this, they're not trying to do it in fucking West Virginia's backyard.
Right and in the same way that they call Palestinians terrorists, they're calling Atlanta activists terrorists. It's this frame of once you call someone a terrorist, you can do anything you want to them. And I think Cop City is part of that plan domestically and internationally.
So what is Cop City?
So Cop City is the name given to a proposed training center that has been known to the public now in Atlanta since about summer of 2021. It was met with immediate fierce opposition from a really, really diverse group of folks throughout Atlanta. And since then, it's been an incredible story of resistance from the people and repression from the state and the city. Where we're at right now is a protester has been murdered. There are over 60 people in this massive RICO case. Something like 40 of them have domestic terrorism charges. There have been multiple militarized SWAT-style raids on activists' homes, including some very recently. It's pretty scary. And like you said, it seems like a local issue, but this is deeply a national issue. I just saw a really good, I forget who put this together. If I figure it out, I'll shout them out. But research that shows there are 3 states in the entire country that are not thinking about or in the process of creating something like Cop City in Atlanta. And I think the states that are not building it is Vermont. Shout out to Vermont. That's where I'm from. I want to say Nebraska and West Virginia, which I should say very, very white states. All of the states not building them are in the top 5 whitest states in the country. God, I guess let's go back to 2020 because that's what they're trying to do. So in the RICO indictment, this massive, sprawling, very strange document that just kind of seeks to criminalize leftist organizing. That's basically what the RICO does. They connect the start of the Stop Cop City movement to the uprisings in 2020, in Atlanta. A gentleman named Rayshard Brooks was napping off a couple of drinks at a Wendy's. He was murdered by Atlanta police. There was massive uprisings, tons of folks in the streets, demanding that Atlanta police be defunded, very similar to the messaging that we saw across the country. And it kind of feels like this is a direct response to that, which is to say the most oppositional response you could get from a bunch of people asking for less police funding, to start this incredibly expensive, dangerous project against huge opposition. So, there are folks on the ground here who still want to support the Atlanta way, which I would say is a real black-white coalition, pro-business, very pro-capitalism. Atlanta's a big business city and a big business state. I think the sort of powers that be, whether that's folks who are elected or business leaders, are trying to say to developers and other people who might see Atlanta as a place to make money, go ahead, you're good. You know, this thing happened in 2020, but don't worry, we're not going to let that happen again. And this massive militarized facility that we're building in the middle of a forest is going to help ensure that that doesn't happen.
And while the current mayor, Andre Dickens, has become sort of the face of the Cop City problem, it didn't start with him.
How did this start? I mean, we are now on year like 3, oh no, my math is rough, of this movement. So it was back in the spring of 2021, sort of following the 2020 uprisings. There was this, you know, massive sort of backlash, front lash from, you know, a lot of sort of like Atlanta's elite ruling class actors. You know, the area of Buckhead is this really white, wealthy part of the city. A lot of corporations are based there. You know, they all freaked out about, you know, the protests. The cops, you know, freaked out. They started calling out sick. They were, you know, doing this blue flu form of protest, you know. So all of these powerful institutions are like seeing that people are in the streets, they're, you know, breaking windows, they're burning cop cars, they're like really rising up against the status quo. And of course, you know, these institutions were not having it. And so early 2021, then Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms announces that they're going to be turning this, you know, almost 400-acre plot of land in southeast Atlanta, just outside city limits, into this massive, you know, they call it a police training facility. We call it Cop City, because it literally, you know, part of the plans for Cop City include a mock city with all of these like pretend city buildings in which, you know, they're going to be practicing all forms of, you know, urban warfare, militarized tactics. And so that was sort of the starting point. It was the mayor announcing it, but it was also, you know, all of these corporations immediately releasing statements through these various, you know, public-private partnerships that they have supporting it, and saying, you know, we're fully behind this, we're going to fundraise for it, you know, whatever. The like chief architect of the plan was the Atlanta Police Foundation, which is this, you know, private nonprofit police foundation that rakes in enormous amounts of money from various corporations, many of which are based in Atlanta, and then in turn, you know, pumps a lot of that money into policing, buys a lot of real estate, provides housing for cops. They run the city's surveillance network. Atlanta is one of the most surveilled cities in the world, and so they really have their hands in like all things policing in Atlanta, and they were the ones who really like designed this plan. So that's the start of it.
And the problem doesn't start and end with Atlanta's black mayors. Many of their black politicians are in on it.
Throughout this, there have been a bunch of votes. The initial vote was, are we going to lease the land to the police foundation to build Cop City? And then there were a couple different votes on the actual funding for Cop City. At each stage, there's 15 council members. At each stage, there's been 4 no votes. There's one council member who's like been pretty vocally opposed, some often. The rest have really not said much at all. I mean, the level of like support from any legislative body, whether it's city council, state government, is basically zero. And then, you know, I mean, to your point about, you know, the makeup of the council, it is, you know, a majority black city council, and part of what gives it so much coverage is like one of the main council members in favor of Cop City is Michael Julian Bond, the son of the, you know, the famous civil rights activist Julian Bond, and he uses his dad all the time, you know, to justify his votes in favor of more policing, keeping the jail open, you know, all of these things. And so like Atlanta also really uses its like civil rights history. Liliana Bakhtiari, District 5, has pretty regularly spoken out against Cop City. You know, I think that Liliana is really the only one who has been outspoken in any way, which I think sometimes leads to not saying as much because then there's a lot of backlash. I would say there's no true champion on the city council.
But while the politicians may not be opposing Cop City, the people of Atlanta are, but the elites just don't give a f.
I've seen a huge shift in Atlanta, and I think it's really like radiated beyond the city as well. You know, the referendum attempt this summer got over 100,000 signatures. That's like more than a fifth of the city.
But the elites who gave them the ability to do the referendum and be heard clearly never anticipated the referendum to stop Cop City would be successful, so they started trying to fight the referendum in court, which is important because it's not the first or only way the people have resisted Cop City in Atlanta. The other protests have resulted in Atlanta police straight up murdering a protester, 26-year-old Tortuguita. The autopsy revealed what other protesters and witnesses said from the jump, that Tortuguita literally had their hands up, don't shoot. But that did not stop the police from shooting them 57 times. The police claimed that Tortuguita refused to come out of their tent in the forest, and that Tortuguita shot at the officers, wounding one first before police decided to riddle them with bullets. However, the coroner said the autopsy did not reveal any gunpowder on Tortuguita's hands to support them having ever held or fired a gun. Just 57 bullet holes showing the police sure did. Although, police claims their investigators later found particles consistent with gunpowder residue. Sure. Although police claimed Tortuguita shot at and wounded an officer before police decided to kill them, a responding officer was actually heard on radio during the incident stated, quote, "You f***ed your own officer up." So people believe the officers actually shot their own officer by mistake while they were shooting at Tortuguita. And does it shock you to learn that the Atlanta DA did not charge the officers? They said that it was, quote, "objectively reasonable to riddle this 26-year-old climate activist with bullets." And it's not just this murder. Atlanta officials generally abuse RICO charges and over-policing their own, so it should be no surprise how else they've responded to the Cop City protesters. Which is what makes it so important that Atlanta officials also ignored the referendum, because they used the law, what some would say is the right way to do things.
There are over 60 people in this massive RICO case. Something like 40 of them have domestic terrorism charges. There have been multiple militarized SWAT-style raids on activists' homes, including some very recently. It's pretty scary. And like you said, it seems like a local issue, but this is deeply a national issue. The referendum that I just mentioned was this very cool attempt last summer to make this like a direct democracy thing and actually put the issue of Cop City on the ballot in Atlanta. That's a really interesting example. I think one of the most radicalizing things about this movement has been how clearly it shows people, even when the state tells you there's an acceptable way to protest and you're not doing it the right way, but if you just did it this way, things would happen. I've had like years now of seeing just people get gaslit by the state, and the referendum feels like one of those things, like, go vote, or some sort of platonic, like, this doesn't actually mean anything, and people were like, okay.
What's also interesting is where they're building Cop City.
It's just like anti-democratic through and through and through. And I mean, this land was, of course, originally Muskogee Creek land, and they were violently dispossessed of this land. Then for like almost 100 years, it was used as a prison farm where people incarcerated by the city were forced to work on behalf of the city. And now they're trying to turn it into Cop City.
After you've seen how Black Atlanta officials give it up as it pertains to the sin of gluttony and their overuse of RICO and violent support of the police state, it shouldn't surprise anyone that for the sin of wrath, we're staying in Atlanta. If you expected Atlanta District Attorney Fani Willis to pop up when we talked about lust because of her affair with Nathan Wade, the prosecutor she gave the Trump case to, you're losing the plot a bit. You are losing the plot. There are too many legitimate, serious criticisms of her for me to get involved with lowbrow misogynoir to put a lot more sauce on her relationship with that prosecutor than anyone would have ever put on it had she been a man. I'm sorry. What I want to talk about is who she is as a prosecutor, which speaks to my fundamental issues with any celebrations of prosecutors or the continued elevation of them as progressive champions. Because the reality is, at its core, what prosecutors do is jail, okay? And those who try to truly be progressive, the Chesa Boudins of the world, get pushed out by media campaigns that were designed to vilify them and blame them for manufactured crime waves and to disappear as soon as they've been replaced with the status quo. It's why I've said in multiple videos that although I undoubtedly wanted Kamala Harris to beat Donald Trump, and we are all gonna regret that she didn't, I was always wary about the long-term impact that would have been had on the Black community, especially little Black girls who would have grown up idolizing the first Black woman president who would have been a prosecutor. We would have been guaranteed at least another generation of Black people invested in the idea that they can be a progressive prosecutor. Or worse, they wouldn't even want to be a progressive prosecutor. They think that the Black community needs to solve issues brought about by decades of intentional underinvestment and overcriminalization with more prison. And they not only think that, they would do it with a vengeance. And it's that vengeance, that wrath, that had Fani Willis out here using RICO charges to prosecute and jail 12 Black teachers for allegedly changing children's test scores so they wouldn't get left behind in a school system that has been starved. The average third grader in Atlanta isn't even reading at grade school level. But instead of recognizing that the school systems need resources, that teachers are underwater, that there's a lot going on that motivated what happened, Fani Willis went out of her way to not just criminalize these teachers, she used RICO charges and pushed for the harshest sentences possible. In a world where those Black teachers could have been punished by losing their license, or maybe have been assisted by given resources and support, Fani said jail. And I'd argue she's guilty of the sin of pride as well, because there was an outcry of critics and people begging her not to do what she was doing. And her response was, quote, "So if what I am being criticized for is doing something to protect people that did not have a voice for themselves, I sit in that criticism and y'all can put it in my obituary," end quote. Truthfully, every politician we've discussed is guilty of this sin. So I figure, why not end this video with this gem?
We cannot only worship Gandhi, we must practice Gandhi. So I'm Gandhi-like. I think like Gandhi. I act like Gandhi. I want to be like Gandhi. I wanted to be the modern day Ramayana and say that we can lead against the forces of evil and take us to the next direction on who we are.
I just want to say this to the audience. I really appreciate the support that you all have been giving me and going out of your way to give me over the last month and to try to speak life into me and encourage me to get rest. I want you to know I'm trying to do the same. I already had this video written shoots about a month before the election, and god damn it, if I knew the election would have played out the way it did, I wouldn't have wrote this bitch, okay? Because I'm not in a spirit to be on Black politicians' ass, even the bad ones. Like, I'm exhausted. I'm sure y'all are all exhausted. Hopefully you were still able to enjoy this video or take something from it. And I just want to let y'all know yet again, I really, really, really appreciate your continued support. And to all of the people who have sent me emails, I just want you to know I read them. I have not been able to respond to all of them, but I have read them and I truly, truly appreciate it. To all the people who left comments on the community page on YouTube, who left comments on the last Olay and Friends, who have tried to, like, every way that y'all can, have tried to send me love and support. I really, 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 really appreciate that. Thank you so much for finding grace for me and caring enough about me at a time where we all have every reason to be consumed with caring about ourselves and our own family and our own loved ones. So it means a lot to me to have an audience of people who I've never met in real life and who've never met me, but have taken the time out to care about me. And I'm grateful. I'm really, 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 really grateful. Thank you. The Olurinatti verse of content is large and constantly expanding, so let me tell you where to find everything. On the main Olurinatti channel, we have Olurinatti productions like the one you just watched. We have my weekly podcast, Olay and Friends, which is also available on Spotify and Apple. We have my true crime meets abolition and criminal justice series called Olurinatti Joints. And we have O Squared, my show where we break down issues that just aren't adding up. If you join the channel, you'll get access to special stickers, emotes, and live streams, as well as my members-only podcast, Olay and Chill. On Olurinatti Pop, I have fun, and we do breakdowns of TV shows and movies like House of the Dragon, Interview with the Vampire, The Boys, Bring It On, and more. And Olurinatti Pop also has a Patreon where you get all the videos uncensored. And last but certainly not least, subscribe to my Substack Olurinatti for not just my really thoughtful essays, but my show Olay, which is exclusive to Substack.